Hello, all my creepy people and pumpkin pals. Welcome to Halloween Watch. We are 10 days away finally from Halloween, so we're counting down the days. Here we go. We are on chapter 18 of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. Where were we last time? They were about to go to a party, I'm pretty sure. Mr. Wickham was in there. They had a dinner, that's right, and then we heard some tea about Mr. Darcy, ooh, and Mr. Wickham, ooh. So, I'm excited to see what happens next, and let's get into it. Alrighty. So, I'll just set this aside for a minute. Put this up here. Alrighty, chapter 18. Till Elizabeth entered the drawing room at Netherfield and looked in vain for Mr. Wickham among the cluster of redcoats there assembled, a doubt of his being present had never occurred to her. She had dressed with more than usual care, and prepared in the highest spirits for the conquest of all that remained unsubdued of his heart, trusting that it was not more than might be won in the course of the evening. But in an instant arose the dreadful suspicion of his being purposely omitted for Mr. Darcy's pleasure in the Bingley's invitation to the officers. Ooh. And though this was not exactly the case, the absolute fact of his absence was pronounced by his friend Denny, who told him that Wickham had been obliged to go to town on business the day before, to attend a demonstration of a new carriage that boasted of being impervious to attacks by the Manky Dreadfuls. Ooh, that's a new way of talking about the zombies, the Manky Dreadfuls. Normally it's the Unmentionables, but I like this one. This assured Elizabeth that Darcy was not answerable for Wickham's absence, and her every feeling of displeasure against the former was sharpened by immediate disappointment. She was resolved against any sort of conversation with him. Having told all her griefs to Charlotte Lucas, whom she had not seen for a week, Elizabeth was soon able to make a voluntary transition to the oddities of her cousin, and to point him out to her particular notice. The first two dances, however, brought a return of distress. They were dances of mortification. Ooh. Mr. Collins, awkward and uncommonly round, gave her all the shame and misery with which a disagreeable partner for a couple of dances can give. The moment of her release from him was ecstasy. She danced next with an officer, and had the refreshment of talking of Wickham, and of hearing that he was universally liked. When those dances were over, she returned to Charlotte Lucas, and was in conversation with her, when she found herself suddenly addressed by Mr. Darcy, who took her so much by surprise in his application for her hand, that, without knowing what she did, she accepted him. He walked away again immediately, and was left to fret over her own want of presence of mind. If Master Liu had seen such a lapse of awareness, 20 lashes at least, and another 20 trip-ups, and down the thousand steps of Quan Hsi. I dare say you will find Mr. Darcy very agreeable, Charlotte tried to console her. Heaven forbid! That would be a great misfortune of all. When the dancing recommenced, however, and Darcy approached to claim her hand, Charlotte could not help cautioning her in a whisper not to be a simpleton, and allow her fancy for Wickham to make her appear unpleasant in the eyes of a man 10 times his consequence. Elizabeth made no answer, and took her place in the set. They stood for some time without speaking a word, and she began to imagine that their silence was to last through the two dances. Oopsies, sorry, I hit the camera there. Speaking where they stood there, last resolved, very good. Till suddenly, fancying that it would be the greater punishment to her partner to oblige him to talk, she made some slight observation on the dance. He replied, and was again silent. After a pause of some minutes, she addressed him a second time with, "It is your turn to say something now, Mr. Darcy. I talked about the dance, and you ought to make some sort of remark on the size of the room, or the number of couples." He smiled, and assured her that whatever she wished him to say should be said. "Very well, that reply will do for the present. But perhaps by and by I may observe that the private balls are much pleasanter than public ones. On the contrary, I find that balls are much more enjoyable when they cease to remain private." Elizabeth could not help but blush, but she was determined that her face betrayed not the slightest hint of amusement. Instead, she added archly, "I have always seen a great similarity in the turn of our minds. We are each of an unsocial, taciturn disposition, unwilling to speak unless we expect to say something that will amaze the whole room, or be regarded as uncommonly clever." "This is no very striking resemblance of your own character, I am sure," he said. How near it may be How near it may be to mine, I cannot pretend to say. You think it faithful portrait undoubtedly. I must not decide on my own performance. He made no answer, and they were again silent till they had gone down the dance. And when he asked her if she and her sisters did not very often meet with zombies on their walks to Meriton, she answered in the affirmative, and, unable to resist the temptation, added, when you met us there the other day, we had just been forming a new acquaintance. Oh, she's going to talk about Wickham. She's going to be like, Mr. Wickham. And he's going to be like, Wickham! We'll see. The effect was immediate. Oh, a deeper shade of hauteur overspread his features, and he had said not a word, and Elizabeth, though blaming herself for her own weakness, could not go on. At length Darcy spoke, and in a constrained manner said, Mr. Wickham is blessed with such happy manners as may ensure his making friends. Whether he may be equally capable of retaining them is less certain. Oh, so sassy. He has been so unlucky as to lose your friendship, replied Elizabeth with emphasis, and his ability to walk for a 12th month, I understand. She's just like, I heard a rumor. Right to his face. That's funny. Darcy made no answer and seemed desirous of changing the subject. At that moment, Sir William Lucas appeared close to them, meaning to pass through the set to the other side of the room. But on perceiving Mr. Darcy, he stopped with a bow of superior courtesy to compliment him on his dancing and his partner. I have been most highly gratified indeed, my dear sir. Such very superior dancing is not often seen. It is evident that you belong to the first circles. Allow me to say, however, that your fair partner does not disgrace you, for she is as ferocious as she is fetching. I must hope to have this pleasure often repeated, especially with a certain desirable event, my dear Eliza, glancing at her sister in Bingley, shall take place. What congratulations will then flow in? But let me not interrupt you, sir. You will not thank me for detaining you from your bewitching young lady. Oh, to think of the many ways her skills could be put to an amorous employ. What does that mean? Amorous employ. Oh, boy. Darcy directed his eyes with a very serious expression toward Bingley and Jane, who were dancing together. Recovering himself, however, he turned to his partner and said, Sir William's interruption has made me forget of what we were talking of. I do not think we were speaking at all. Sir William could not have interrupted two people in the room who had less to say for themselves. We've tried 2 or 3 subjects already without success, and what we are talking of next I cannot imagine. What do you think of Orientals? He said, smiling. Oh my goodness! What? Orientals! Oh! No, I am sure we never met the same or had the same feelings towards them. But if that be the case, we may compare our different opinions. I think them a strange lot. I am sorry to anybody watching this right now. So, both in appearance and custom. Though having studied solely in Japan, I admit that the opinion may be incomplete. I should be most interested to hear of your time in the company of Chinamen. Oh God, I'm going to get canceled. No, I cannot think of Orientals in a ballroom. My head is always full of something else. The present always occupies you in such senses, does it? Yes, always, she replied, without knowing what she said, for her thoughts had wandered far from the subject. The pain of Master Liu's glowing brand searing her flesh, to sparring matches with her sisters atop a beam no wider than their swords, as pikes waited to punish an ill-placed foot below. Her mind returning to the present, she suddenly exclaimed, I remember hearing you once say, Mr. Darcy, that you hardly ever forgave, and that your resentment, once created, was unappeasable. You are very cautious, I suppose, as to its being created. I am, he said, with a firm voice. And never allow yourself to be blinded by prejudice? I hope not. It is particularly incumbent on those who never change their opinion to be secure of judging properly at first. May I ask to what these questions tend? Merely to the illustration of your character, she said endeavorously, and to shake off her gravity. I'm trying to make it out. And what is your success? She shook her head. I do not get on at all. I hear such different accounts of you as puzzle me exceedingly. I can readily believe, answered he gravely, that reports may vary greatly with respect to me, and I could wish, Miss Bennet, that you were not to sketch my character at the present moment. But if I do not take your likeness now, I may never have another opportunity. I would by no means suspend any pleasure of yours, he coldly replied. She said no more, and they went down the other dance and parted in silence. and on either side dissatisfied, though not to an equal degree, for in Darcy's breast there was a tolerable powerful feeling toward her, which soon procured her pardon, and directed all his anger against another. Elizabeth then sought out her eldest sister. "I want to know what you have learnt about Mr. Wickham, but perhaps you have been too pleasantly engaged to think of any third person, in which case you may be sure of my pardon." "No," replied Jane, "I have not forgotten him, but I have nothing satisfactory to tell you. Mr. Bingley does not know the whole of his history, and is quite ignorant of the circumstances which have principally offended Mr. Darcy. But he will vouch for the good conduct, the probity, and honour of his friend. I am sorry to say, by his account, Mr. Wickham is by no means a respectable young man." Ooh. Some more drama now the other way around. Mr. Bingley does not know Mr. Wickham himself. "No, he never saw him till the other morning at Meryton." "I've not a doubt of Mr. Bingley's sincerity," said Elizabeth warmly, "but you must excuse my not being convinced by assurances only. Mr. Bingley's defence of his friend was a very able one, but since he is unacquainted with several parts of the story, I shall venture to think of both gentlemen as I did before. So thanks, but no thanks." She then changed the discourse to one more gratifying to each. Elizabeth listened with delight to the happy though modest hopes which Jane entertained of Mr. Bingley's regard, and said all in her power to heighten her confidence in it. On their being joined by Mr. Bingley himself, Elizabeth withdrew to Miss Lucas, to whose inquiry after the pleasantness of Darcy she had scarcely replied before her fat cousin, Mr. Collins, came up to them and told her with great exultation that he had just been so fortunate as to make a most important discovery. "Ah, may I suppose then that you have discovered the location of the buffet?" said Elizabeth rudely. Wow, that is rude. That's pretty rude. "No, I have found out," said he, "by singular accident, that there is now in the room a near relation of my patroness. I happened to overhear the gentleman himself mentioning to the young lady who does the honours of the house the names of his cousin Miss Dubourg, and of her mother Lady Catherine. How wonderfully these sort of things occur! What a small world. Who would have thought my meeting with perhaps a nephew of Lady Catherine de Bourgh in this assembly? I am most thankful that the discovery is made in time for me to pay my respects to him, which I am now going to do." "You are not going to introduce yourself to Mr. Darcy." "Indeed I am. I shall entreat his pardon for not having done it earlier. I believe him to be Lady Catherine's nephew." Elizabeth tried hard to dissuade him from such a scheme, assuring him that Mr. Darcy would consider his addressing him without introduction as an impertinent freedom, rather than a compliment to his aunt, that it must belong to Mr. Darcy, the superior in consequence, to begin the acquaintance. Wow, so many rules, so many social rules. I just want to go say hi to this guy, and you're like, I can't, he's too powerful, whatever. When Elizabeth ceased speaking, Mr. Collins replied thus: "My dear Elizabeth, I have the highest opinion in the world in your excellent judgment in all matters with your scope of your understanding, particularly in the slaying of Satan's armies. But permit me to say that there must be a wide difference between the established forms of ceremony amongst the laity and those which regulate the clergy. After all, you may wield God's sword, but I wield his wisdom." Fuck off. "And in its wisdom, my dear cousin, which will ultimately rid us of our present difficulties with the undead." You will excuse me for saying so, but I have never seen a zombie's head taken off by words, nor do I ever expect to. Exactly. You must allow me to follow the dictations of my conscience on this occasion, which leads me to perform that what I look on as a point of duty. With a low bow, he left her to attack Mr. Darcy, whose reception of his advances she eagerly watched, and whose astonishment at being so addressed was very evident. Her cousin prefaced his speech with a solemn bow, and though she could not hear a word of it, she felt as if hearing it all, and saw on the motion of his lips the word apology, Hunsford, and Lady Catherine de Bourgh. It vexed her to see him expose himself to such a man. Mr. Darcy was eyeing him with unrestrained wonder, and when at last Mr. Collins allowed him time to speak, replied with an air of distant civility. Mr. Collins, however, was not discouraged from speaking again, and Mr. Darcy's contempt seemed abundantly increasing with the length of his second speech, and at the end of it he only made he only made him a slight bow and moved the other way. As Elizabeth had no longer any interest of her own to pursue, she turned her attention almost entirely on her sister and Mr. Bingley. She saw in all the felicity which a marriage of true affection could bestow, and she felt capable, under such circumstances, of endeavouring even to like Bingley's two sisters. Her mother's thoughts were plainly bent the same way, and she determined not to venture near her, lest she suffer her endless prattling. When they sat down to supper, therefore, Elizabeth considered it at most unlucky perverseness which placed them within one of each other, and deeply was she vexed to find that her mother was talking to Lady Lucas freely, openly, and of nothing else but her expectation that Jane would soon be married to Mr. Bingley. It was an animating subject, and Mrs. Bennet seemed incapable of fatigue while enumerating the advantages of the match. His being such a charming young man, and so rich, and living but 3 miles from them, were the first points of self-gratulation. And then it was such a comfort to think of how fond the two sisters were of Jane, and to be certain that they must desire the connection as much as she could do. It was, moreover, such a promising thing for her younger daughters, as Jane's marrying so greatly must throw them into the way of other rich men. Oh, what a joy to see them all thus provided for! To see them entertaining at their own estates, raising their own children, instead of all this silly training and fighting. She concluded with many good wishes that Lady Lucas might soon be equally fortunate, though evidently and triumphantly believing there was no chance of it. In vain did Elizabeth endeavour to check the rapidity of her mother's word, or persuade her to describe her felicity in a less audible whisper, for, to her inexpressible vexation, she could not perceive that the chief of it was overheard by Mr. Darcy, who sat opposite them. Her mother only scolded her for being nonsensical, her breath thick with meat and port. "What is Mr. Darcy to me, pray, that I should be afraid of him? I am sure we owe him no such particular civility as to be obliged to say nothing he may not like to hear." "For heaven's sake, madame, speak lower. What advantage can it be for you to offend Mr. Darcy? You will never recommend yourself to his friend by doing so." You will never recommend yourself to his friend by doing so. You're not going to be friends with him. Just say it that way. That's a weird way to say it, in my opinion. But, I mean, this is an old book. Glad we don't talk like that right now. Nothing that she could say, however, had any influence. Elizabeth blushed and blushed, again with the shame and vexation. So many vexations today for Elizabeth. All vexed up. She could not help frequently glance her eye at Mr. Darcy, though every glance convinced her of what she dreaded. For though he was not always looking at her mother, she was convinced that his attention was invariably fixed up by her. The expression of his face changed gradually from indignant contempt to a composed and steady gravity. At length, however, Miss Bennet had no more to say, and Lady Lucas, who had been long yawning at the reception of delights which she saw no likelihood of sharing, was left to the discomforts of cold ham and chicken. Elizabeth now began to revive, but not long was the interval of tranquillity, for, when supper was over, not a servant was to be found to attend to their empty plates. Seeing his guest grow restless, Mr. Bingley rose from his seat and excused himself, no doubt to scold his steward for the embarrassment, and there's a picture. Yeah, look at this. What? Yeah, that's what he's about to find, so, wowee. Poor servants. Look at the hand! Look at the hand holding that. Oh my goodness. Love it. Wish there was more pictures of this, honestly. But, great. Upon his return, Elizabeth promptly reached for her ankle dagger. Mr. Bingley's white face and troubled countenance were enough to solicit such a reaction. "Mr. Darcy, if I may have the pleasure of your company in the kitchen," said Mr. Bingley. Darcy rose, taking care not to move too quickly, lest he alarm the guests. Elizabeth took it upon herself to follow him. When Darcy took notice of this, he turned to her and said in a whisper, "Miss Bennet, I would much prefer you took your seat. I am quite capable of attending to Mr. Bingley myself." "Of that I have no doubt, Mr. Darcy, just as I have no doubt in my mind, or in my ability to form my own opinion on the matter. Now, do you wish to cause a stir, or shall we go to the kitchen?" You gonna shut up and let go, or are we gonna make a scene right here? Because pretty sure there's some zombies around. Mr. Bingley led the two of them down a hidden staircase and into the cellar, which was divided into two halves by a long corridor. one side belonging to the servants' quarters and an armory, the other to the exercise parlor and kitchen. It was in the latter that a most unfortunate sight awaited them. Two adult unmentionables, both of them male, busied themselves feasting upon the flesh of the household staff. How two zombies could have killed a dozen servants, 4 maids, 2 cooks, and a steward was beyond Elizabeth's comprehension, but she knew precisely how they had gotten in. The cellar door had been opened to let in a cool night air and relieve the oppression of the wood stoves. "Well, I suppose we ought to take all their heads, lest they be born to darkness," she said. Oh my goodness, that is the reality of the situation. You gotta be dark, right? We've all seen zombie stuff. Mr. Bingley observed the desserts his poor servants had been attending to at the time of their demise. A delightful array of tarts, exotic fruits, and pies, sadly soiled by blood and brains, and thus unusable. "I don't suppose," said Darcy, "that you would give me the honour of dispensing of this unhappy business alone. I should never forgive myself if your gown were soiled." "The honour is all yours, Mr. Darcy." Elizabeth thought she detected a slight smile on his face. Here, one more look at the picture before I saw. That is just gross. She watched as Darcy drew his blade and cut down the 2 zombies with a savage yet dignified movements. He then made quick work of beheading the slaughtered staff, upon which Mr. Bingley politely vomited into his hands, and there was no denying Darcy's talents as a warrior. If only, she thought, his talents as a gentleman were their equal. If only, she thought, his talents as a gentleman were their equal. When they returned to the ball, they found the spirits of the others very much disturbed. Mary was entertaining them at the pianoforte, her shrill voice testing the patient ears of all present. Elizabeth looked at her father to entreat his interference, lest Mary should be singing all night. He took a hint, and when Mary had finished her second song, said aloud, "That will do extremely well, child. You have delighted us long enough. Let the other young ladies have time to exhibit." To Elizabeth it appeared that had her family made an agreement to embarrass themselves as much as they could during the evening, it would have been impossible for them to play their parts with more success. The rest of the evening brought her little amusement. She was teased by Mr. Collins, who continued most perseveringly by her side, and though he could not prevail on her to dance with him again, he put it out of her power to dance with others, by using his thick middle to hide her from view. In vain she did not offer to introduce him to any young lady in the room. He assured her that he was perfectly indifferent to it, that his chief object was by delicate attentions to recommend himself to her, and that he should therefore make a point of remaining close to her the whole evening. There was no arguing upon such a project. She owed her greatest relief to her friend Miss Lucas, who often joined them, good-naturedly engaged Mr. Collins' conversation to herself. She was at least free from offence of Mr. Darcy's further notice, though often standing within a very short distance of her, quite disengaged. He never came near enough to speak. She felt it to be the probable consequence of her allusions to Mr. Wickham, and rejoiced in it. When at length they arose to take leave, Mrs. Bennet was most pressingly civil in her hope of seeing the whole family soon at Longbourn, and addressed herself especially to Mr. Bingley, to assure him how happy he would make them by eating at a family dinner with them at any time, without the ceremony of formal invitation. Bingley was a grateful pleasure, and he readily engaged for taking the earliest opportunity of waiting on her, after his return from London, whither he was obliged to go the next day for a meeting of the Society of Gentlemen for a peaceful solution to our present difficulties, of which he was a member and patron. Mrs. Bennet was perfectly satisfied and quitted the house under the delightful persuasion that she should see her daughter settled at Netherfield, her weapons retired forever in the course of 3 or 4 months. Of having another daughter married to Mr. Collins, she thought with equal certainty and with considerable, though not equal pleasure. Elizabeth was the last dear to her of all her children, and though the man and the match were quite good enough for her, the worth of each was eclipsed by Mr. Bingley and Netherfield. And that'll do it for this part in Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. We're going to reach chapter 19 next. We're actually on page 83, so we're making a good amount of progress. 10 days left. I think we can make it. Yeah. And
Have a spooky season. Bye-bye.